Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Occulted. Thank you so much for joining me today. So, we are going to talk about the occult science of paganism and the pagan period, and also of blood or blood magic, and also sacrifice. So, this is part of a little kind of mini series in my Occulted series where we examine a death cult that operates behind the scenes. And in the first discussion about this, 2 episodes ago, I was speaking in regards to the recent Kirk assassination. And not that the Kirk assassination is absolutely 100% some kind of occult ritual. That's actually not what the point of this series is. The point is that I analyze any kind of public event and examine whether there are occult elements to it or esoteric aspects to it at all. And then every person has to draw their own opinion from that. So this is so that we can learn and that we can understand not just esoterica from a very dry place, but it really helps to be able to apply this to current events. It just allows it to sink in that much deeper. So we're going to focus on, today we're going to focus on why there is such a thing as a death cult or black magic. Why does that exist? And how exactly does it operate? How does it operate in the spiritual world, in people? What is the light side? And we're going to speak about this very generally just to understand it. It's not going to be a complete dissertation on all these different pagan cultures or anything like that. We're just looking at the mechanics of it today. So the last episode we discussed the eclipse, and that was sort of more of a analysis on the celestial aspects of a ritual. And we sort of ended that session discussing, again, this idea that we have to confront the reality that there are people who practice black magic. There are people who have religions and occult ideologies around death, around, very degenerate things, and that this is a way to really get power to yourself, real power. Real wealth can come from these practices. Now, for most people, again, this is not something that people care to think of or even think it's real. They think it's a story. But part of confronting corruption that everybody gets so angry about in the public is confronting the occult element of it. And only when the occult aspect is confronted and understood can we actually understand the more mundane levels of corruption. So this is actually what we should be going after hard, because this is where, groups that do operate on pure corruption and degeneracy, this is what they depend on. They depend on people literally not understanding what they're doing and thinking that this doesn't exist, right? So what is, paganism roughly? So generally when people think about dark magic practices, we usually think about like cursing or hexing or ritual death, blood magic. A lot of these things actually originated and came to be during the pagan period of humanity. And it's only after the incarnation of Christ that we see how people operated spiritually change. And with the incarnation of Christ, we see that humanity begins to turn inward and we begin to really individuate and really move away from sort of a more tribal, group-oriented existence into a real individualistic way of life. And civilization actually completely begins to change around the idea that we actually are all individuals and we should have a culture based in merit, and we should have an idea of natural law, and we should be working towards creating a kind of environment on earth as it is in heaven through creating a civilization and a culture that mirrors the laws in heaven. And so we start getting into, okay, now we can operate as a group still, we can have civilization, we can have culture, but we have to do that through an objective understanding of God. Now, during the pagan period, there was not an objective understanding of God. There was not this ability to scientifically look at the cosmos. We don't develop that kind of consciousness until after Christ, because consciousness is evolving in a distinct compounding pattern. So the biggest mistake that people make, and this applies to anthropologists, to, even New Age people, spiritual people, people who talk about history, is that the further you go back in time, the more different human consciousness and perception is. The further you go back in time, the more clairvoyant humanity is, and the more of a group consciousness and the more tribal humanity is. So when we look at the pagan period and the height of the pagan period, we're looking at a time in humanity where we were completely interconnected, completely tribal, and there was no concept of the individual. Okay, if there was leadership, if there was a shaman, if there was a priest king, if there was some kind of leader, that leader was not leading because they had individuated, and they were not leading from their own thoughts, their own mind, their own consciousness. The idea of the shaman leader or the chief or the priest king was that individual actually had an angel working through them. They were the sun hero, the sun initiate. They were a human being that had spiritual abilities, so that an angel was actually working through them, which gave them the capacity to lead. So during the pagan period, we actually don't see leadership from a human being that is from their own mind, from their own thought, operating as an individual and leading the herd. That is something that doesn't come about as a culture, on a large scale in society until after the incarnation of Christ, after the turning point of time, as Rudolf Steiner would say. So this is a really big contrast here. Think about this. For most of our existence, we actually operated in a tribal group soul way. We operated as though we were in an organism. So that everybody was interconnected in an organism and everybody sort of had their role, and there really was no individual necessarily higher or lower. There were just people who could interface with spirit and those who could not necessarily do that. But there wasn't this concept of leadership that we have today. And you can see that in the earlier period, we had intense spirituality. We had intense clairvoyance. We could see the spiritual world. All of the gods, the Greek gods, the pagan gods, those are angels and archangels. And we could see them. We could see them in the lightning. We could see them in the river. We could see them in the wind. We could see elemental beings with animals, with flowers, with plants. We could see the spiritual world. That's where all the fairy lore comes from. That's where all of the stories about little people and giants and all this stuff actually in part comes from, is that humanity lived in a very thinly veiled existence where the spirit world operated right along with us. And so we created rituals and culture around beings that we could actually see and know clairvoyantly. We were participating in nature and heaven as part of it. Not as individuals yet, but as a kind of group organism, as part of nature, as an intricate part of nature, as part of the organism of heaven, the earthly part of heaven, if you can grasp that. But then over time, what ends up happening is we get heavier and heavier and heavier, and we sort of get pulled more and more into materialism. Now, this prepares us to receive the Christ. This makes us more of an individual. We start looking at things more and more objectively, slowly over time, slowly with every generation. And we begin to lose our spiritual abilities. We begin to lose our clairvoyance. But as we lose our clairvoyance, we begin to gain our sort of independence from the group as well. We begin to consider who are we really? Who am I really? Who am I outside of the family? Who am I outside of the group? What is my talent? What is my purpose? What is my soul's calling? What is my unique relationship with God? What is my uniqueness? Where do I personally meet God in myself? And so more and more now these questions are coming up, and humanity begins to slowly separate. Some this happens a lot faster. And for some, this happens very, very slowly, and they're still very much needing to be part of that group, needing to be in a collective environment, needing to be part of that organism, as though a mother and child cannot separate from one another. So some of the population begins to evolve into this condition of individuality, but the vast majority of the population does not. That's just the reality of life. It's very hard to individuate from the group. It feels like you're dying. It's very hard. A lot of people don't have the confidence, the trust in themselves. And we're still in that position today. A lot of people would rather hurt themselves potentially than separate from what their family thinks, what their friends think, what the world, their culture thinks. But to be individual is to be upward. It is to be upright. And that is the call for all of us. It is to be one with yourself and God. And that's not possible when you have this collectivist kind of group existence that characterized the pagan period. Now, I want to be clear that when you hear, I would say, like a dogmatic style of Christian conversation around this, it doesn't really grasp what paganism was and what paganism really is to humanity. We always hear something like, well, those pagans were really awful and crazy and practicing human sacrifice and superstitious, and they were like animals and having, weird orgies and sex magic and stuff like that. But that's not actually describing paganism objectively. That's describing the final era of paganism, which is the decadent era of paganism. So every cycle of humanity has two phases, every single one. There is a golden age in which there is a spiritual lesson or a certain kind of development that humanity has to obtain. So during the pagan period, in the height of it, we're learning all the archetypal patterns of heaven and earth by participating in them directly, not as an individual, but as part of nature as a whole. And we're creating rituals and culture around being one with everything as part of this organism. So we're learning all the process like in big cycles. We're understanding it. And we go through that period for thousands and thousands of years, largely different kinds and breeds of paganism until the incarnation of Christ. Exactly. But this was a high point for human civilization and culture for that time, because that's where we were cognitively and perception wise. A totally different place than we are today. And at the height of paganism, there was no human sacrifice. There was no blood magic. There was no animal sacrifice. That is not present in the high time of the pagan period. That only happens near the end of paganism. So there's a golden age in where you see the height of any epoch, the height of any spiritual period. And then it begins to decline. It begins to become decadent. It begins to become degenerate. And all of the practices that were once done in the golden era of that time begin to invert. So Satanism really is just inversionism. All Satanism is, or all black magic is a direct inversion of natural law and a humiliation of natural law and a humiliation of God. Because when something becomes mortified, when something becomes humiliated, there's a small amount of energy that can be consumed. It's very crude, it's very primitive, it's very materialistic, but a lot of people's energy body operates in that crude and primitive way. It's not a sophisticated structure going on there, right? So there's a high point of paganism that characterizes its first phases, in which humanity operated as like a group soul. If there was a chief, if there was a priest king, they were that way because they were able to interface with an angel or an archangel. So even when they're leading, it's not really them. It is an angel working through them. So there is no individuality during this period as we understand it today. As we move deeper and deeper and kind of sink deeper into materialism, and our attention is drawn more and more into the five senses in order to become individuals, in order to focus ourselves a little bit more in matter, because we need that compression, we need that materialization impulse to individuate. So the more materialized and earthly we become, the more of an opportunity to individuate from the whole we have. So we lose that spiritual clairvoyance, we lose these spiritual abilities, but we gain mind, we gain intellect, the ability to look at things objectively, do analysis, objective critical thought. This is not something that human beings had during the height of the pagan period. Everything it was all superstition because we didn't really have the level of mind that we have now. And that actually doesn't kick in a big way until actually around the 1400s, the 1500s. So we've really only had the kind of powerful intellectual mind as a human being for maybe 500 or 600 years. Okay, because again, human beings evolve through what are called epochs. And these epochs are not just periods of exact time, they also represent different developments of human and planetary consciousness. And these epochs can be tracked through the Platonic year, and you can even track the rise and fall of civilizations. I talk about this repeatedly on my channel here. But this is also available in spiritual science and anthroposophy. Most Western esotericism is going to have this concept as a center point to understand the evolution of consciousness and also the evolution of the very elements of our planet, the very condition of our planet. And human consciousness cannot be separated from the earth because we are evolving together in an exact fashion. The earth creates the environment for life. So, and during paganism, another thing is that it was a pluralistic period. So we saw all of the angels, we saw all of the archangels, we saw the elementals. So we had a pluralistic system because we saw these entities in heaven, we saw them around us. And this is why when you get to these earlier religions, these earlier forms of occultism, they have many different gods. Because when those religions were created, humanity was clairvoyant. And they could actually see the angels and archangels and elementals and describe them by their appearance and their property and recreate them. The more we move forward in time, we lose that clairvoyance and we start to describe the spiritual world differently, more scientifically, more mathematically. So how we describe the spiritual world is very much dependent on our consciousness. And the further you go back in time, the more pluralistic things are, the more you move forward and you get into Western esotericism and not in the Eastern systems anymore, then you get the esotericism around the individual. That becomes very, very precise, though it does exist in the Eastern systems. It's the core truths are there, but you don't get the real initiation science and certain aspects of it until the Western system, which is the scientific level of analysis of the spiritual world. So you can see things, you can see that things go from completely clairvoyant, totally being able to perceive the spiritual world and everything in it, and you're just part of this organism of spirit and life, to this separation from that, more and more feeling a separation from God, losing spiritual sight, losing that, having record of it, and being obvious that once, you look at the great Indian mystics, the great Eastern mystics, and what they were talking about in these atavistic trances, and what they were describing has been a backbone for the world in keeping these things alive. Because we did become blind. And then when you get the Western side, you get esoteric Christianity, you start getting into this ascent, this spiritualization of humanity through becoming an individual, and then spiritualizing yourself as an individual through Christ and everything that comes with Christian initiation. So this is the arc that I want us to understand, because there's nothing more inaccurate than just showing people like photos of like a Canaanite, Babylonian sacrifice, or like, the Mayan sacrifices, or whatever it is. I mean, the world was embroiled in blood. Every single culture practiced blood sacrifice. I have an episode of Revival called The Era of the Witch, where I talk about this. It's on my channel. Check that out. But the whole world was embroiled in black magic at one point, in human sacrifice, in blood magic. And so what ends up happening is that when we talk about the pagan period, we only talk about it from the perspective of its dark age. We're not addressing the reality of how consciousness has evolved over time. We're not understanding the high point of paganism. We can't actually understand the dark age of paganism and the blood magic and the human sacrifice and all that really dark stuff unless you understand the high point. Now, the high point of this, there was never blood sacrifice. That only began when human beings began to lose their vision, but we're needing spiritual power still. So initially, you would still have this concept of sacrifice, that in order for something to be born, in order for something new to emerge, either in nature or within the human being, something would have to be given. Right? This was a huge part in early human spirituality, is that in order for anything to come to be, there had to be a sacrifice. and that sacrifice creates the substrate of life. So think about this in your own existence. In order for you to become a higher functioning person, you're going to have to sacrifice some of your bad habits. You're going to actually have to place that on the altar of God and say, I am going to give you this bad habit, and I am going to sacrifice that so that something greater is going to come into my life, and you suffer. When you say, I'm no longer going to smoke cigarettes, I'm no longer going to drink alcohol, that's a sacrifice for God. Because God smiles when you become the best version of yourself. So when we fast, it's a sacrifice. And as gestures, even when we didn't understand that necessarily during the pagan period, which we didn't necessarily understand that's more modern, we used to sacrifice incense smoke. The sacrifice was not blood in the early days of paganism. It was the smoke from your incense. It was grain, it was wheat, it was fruit, it was your chanting, it was your prayers, it was your time in contemplation with God. It was anything that you could do to dedicate yourself to God when you could be doing something else. And then anything that you had, that you needed, that you gave to God, that was also sacrifice. It was very simple, but it was not killing. You were not killing an animal to build a temple or to manifest something in your life. You weren't killing a person to do divination rites. That is 100% degenerate, okay? There is no place for animal sacrifice, for human sacrifice, for blood sacrifice of any kind. It was never holy. It was never appropriate. And it should not be happening if you want a orderly and caring and compassionate, meaningful culture. So those things are not even really pagan, is what I'm trying to say. That's what happened when the pagan traditions inverted, and basically demonic entities and people became possessed and started doing really dark and degenerate things. So I want to make that clear. And also, Christianity will also experience a decadent period. This isn't just on, earlier religions or whatever. Christianity is going through a transition where it's going to have to become more esoteric and include a understanding of spiritual science. That's going to make it living, right? Or it's going to eventually regress into a series of laws. So this is where Christianity stands. Christianity either has to rise and organize itself around spiritual science, which is the objective understanding of the spiritual world and Christ, and working towards developing the senses to perceive him directly and work as an independent individual with Christ. That's the next phase of Christianity. That's what it has to be. That's what it was always meant to be. But we were, again, moving from this communalism, and we've had to have this intense dogmatism, this intense structure to prepare us for direct union with him. So it will spiritualize into that structure, or it will degrade and degenerate into a series of laws. And a good sign of that always is that when people don't understand the resurrection, they don't think that Jesus actually lived, they don't think that he's a historical figure, they don't think the resurrection happened, they don't understand it, they can't describe it. That is the sign when we don't understand the resurrection mysteries. We don't understand the Christ. And that's when we'll know that Christianity has now entered into its decadent phase. It's been captured by too much dogmatism, right, which is Armonic. And it will be broken down into just a series of laws, which are basically like every other religion in existence, and it will be one world religion because they all have the same laws anyway. So the key here is real Christianity begins with understanding Christ. And Christ begins in our life with understanding immortality, the immortal body and the establishment of the immortal body and eternal life, and understanding his life, and understanding especially the resurrection mysteries. So that's how Christianity will become decadent. And it's already happening. I already see people who claim to be Christians, but they're really just entering into Christianity from a place of pure dogmatic understanding where it's just a series of laws for them. It's just a community for them. It's just a cultural thing, which is not the purpose of Christ's life and death, to be clear. He didn't come here and die so that we could have a bunch of bland milquetoast laws. He came here so that we could be immortal, like him, through him. And that's going to take walking with the living Christ in us, which means directly being in union with him, which is the second coming. The second coming is his presence in you directly. His second coming is completely spiritual and personal for you. Okay, so that's the difference between paganism and the post-Christian period or the post-Christ period. And that's to say, even as a Christian, listen, like every single epoch will have a decadent phase of its most common religion, of its spiritual condition, including Christianity. And how it happens when you get the evolution of time as well is that with every system evolving, so say you have like Hinduism, you have Buddhism, you have Taoism, and then you have other things going on, and then you have Christianity. There's nothing in the Western tradition there's nothing in the Western tradition and the Eastern there's nothing in the Eastern tradition that the West doesn't have. So when you have you have a direct evolution and continuum of spirituality. And then something new is added every time because consciousness is evolving. Does that make sense? So there's nothing in Eastern mysticism or Eastern religion as a science that doesn't exist as a concept in Western esotericism. The only difference is that Western esotericism provides initiation science because we only have the capacity to spiritualize into an immortal form for basically really 2,000 years. That wasn't available to every single person until then. So you get a continuation of the truths. Sometimes things will fall away because of the level of focus or whatever. And then you get something new added. And in 2,000 years from now, certain things will fall away from what we use, and something new will be added, and you'll have, and it will continue. So we do have to see spiritual evolution as a continuum, really. The truths are carried on, some are dropped, some are carried for whatever reason, and something new is added. All right, so to conclude, one of the biggest discrepancies that occurs when examining early humanity is to assume that we have the same kind of perception and consciousness during the pagan era as we do now. This is not the case. During the pagan era, humanity was driven by different kinds of forces, the forces of the angels that appeared all around them in nature. They called these beings, the angels, gods, and would apply different elements, myths, and symbols to their activity. The highest level of existence was to have an angel speak and work through you, which allowed you to become a priest, king, or a shaman. In this way, humanity operated in an entirely different state, one that by comparison today was as though it was living in a dream. It was as though humanity was in like a hypnagogic state compared to now. So the earlier periods of humanity, even like 3,000 years ago, humanity was actually in more of like a dreamlike condition compared to the alertness that we have now, which is pretty incredible to think of. And also, I have to add one more thing. When humanity was in its earlier phases, in this more pagan era, angels really protected humanity. Whenever there was a sort of spiritual process that was going on, or a ritual or something going on in someone's life, the angels really absorbed a lot of the excess energy. They were responsible for carrying out a lot of the evolutionary tasks, and they were very hands-on, kind of like parents with children, right? And then, so humanity had a kind of protection in the early days where angels actually absorbed a lot of the behavior and activities of humanity. And then as we move forward, getting closer to the incarnation of Christ, the angels begin to step back. Why? Because with the incarnation of Christ, we become individuals, right? We get our I. In occult science or anthroposophy, you'd say, we finally get our I that becomes available. I mean, earlier there would have been some people that were at that level, but the majority of people would not be. And so after the turning point of time, after the incarnation of Christ, the world operates completely differently. Human beings operate completely differently. And the angels step away. And the angels move on to a different phase in their own development, in their own existence, the ones that are working with the earth. So we have to see that even with the procession of time with humanity, there is still, even then, the procession of the other kingdoms of life. The elementals are progressing. The angels are progressing in their own way. And they kind of vacate certain positions with humanity. They kind of leave these empty seats. Now, I have to say that because we're going to get into that a little bit later. Who fills those seats where the angels used to be? So the angels kind of step back and they say, humanity is now getting old enough. We're not going to be as obvious. We're stepping back. Their perception's changing. They're receiving the Christ. And now we have to do these things. And we're in a completely different phase of development in our own right. And with that, we have to understand that when the angels begin to step back and stop fulfilling all these kind of almost parental roles with us, that we have to start taking more responsibility as well. And it's sort of like we have to grow up. Thus, in the very beginning of this period, humanity was clairvoyant and developed their spiritual rights with full vision and direct participation of the angels whom worked into the natural world. Over time, humanity drifted further and further away from their natural clairvoyance. We begin to disconnect and forget about the angels and the spiritual world that surrounds us. In fact, in that blindness, man began to believe that he alone is responsible for the world's events, weather, crops, and war. So the more materialistic we became, the more individualistic we became, the more we moved away from heaven, the more heaven kind of moved away from us and let us go. And we began to think, oh, I'm responsible for the weather. I'm responsible for, we started to think that we were sort of individually or independently responsible for things that we really weren't. And so there's this tension, there's this push-pull for what are we how are we to interact with nature? How are we to interact with each other now that we're becoming individuals? What are we responsible for? What is God responsible for? This is an eternal battle that we're still involved in now. I mean, you know, look at the weather modification, look at all these different things. Like, we still don't understand how much we should interfere with nature. You know, should we genetically engineer every fruit? You know, every child, every animal? Or should we have a relationship with creation, but one that is much more surrendered, much more looking for the deeper patterns into it to know ourselves? This is a struggle that we've had since very, very early times, when we lost our clairvoyance, when we lost that spiritual connection, and we started to force things, and we became very seduced over time. Now that we couldn't directly interact with God and the angels, now we're thinking that we are God slowly over time, because we know God exists, but we don't know how to interact with him. And so now we start thinking that we're God. We don't know how to place him in our life properly, right? And there's just that desire in some groups for just sheer power, and that's how they know God and interact with God, which is a kind of primitive sickness, really. So things that man participated in during the golden age of paganism were now things he felt he could control. So in the earlier period, we would just participate in solstice. We would participate in all of these different moon phases, and they would just move through us, and we would see what would come forward, and we were in direct harmony with nature as like a part of the organism. But then we start to seek control through these things, which is the inversion of real individuality, of real individuation. Because the individuality really appears to the self, your true higher self appears to you actually through things like service, through morality, through tuning with God's will. It's through the dissolution of the lower ego, actually, that you learn who you truly are. But during this transition, many, many, many people began to think their lower ego, their lower urges, is their identity. That this animalistic part of themselves, this primitive part of themselves, is who they are. And that by feeding that and feeding that they can have some kind of power, which they associate with God. So leaders and shaman and different groups became increasingly selfish, and the world creeps further and further into materialism. We became blinder and blinder and blinder. And with every generation that would go by, you would have this kind of splitting into people who are moving more towards healthy individuation, whatever that looked like, whether it be maintaining the correct form of paganism, which didn't include blood sacrifice at all, or animal killing and whatever. There were people who kept these things pure. They never participated in this kind of degenerate stuff that took over the world. But most people, most cultures did have some element of this black magic in it, as we're going to see. People became increasingly selfish, and the world creeps further and further into materialism. And the deeper we go into materialism, the more a large portion of humanity clings to their lower ego, because there is this reality hanging over every single person that the final task for human beings on the planet, really the ultimate task, is to get beyond an animal level of existence, get beyond the lower centers, get beyond the lower urges, get beyond attachment. As the Eastern monks would say, get beyond attachment. But that, again, that feels like death. It's the hardest thing in the world to do is to release your attachments, because you feel like you're being destroyed, because you are. And so black magic absolutely comes from a clinging. It is the refusal to die. Of course it is, because it's the refusal to confront your fear. It's the refusal to attune to God and God's will, which is the only will that actually exists. And these two schisms are forming more and more and more. You're getting people who are moving into black magic cults that are becoming increasingly more perverse, increasingly darker, requiring more and more blood, requiring more and more darkness, becoming more and more possessed. And then you're getting probably a smaller group that is trying to maintain spiritual connection like everybody else, losing our clairvoyance, losing these abilities as we become individuals, but trying to operate in a different way. And so there's always been two different streams on the planet. One that is moving towards Christ and one that's moving towards Antichrist. And listen, Christ has been in union with this planet since the planet's inception. Of course he has. If Christ wasn't in union with the planet since its very inception, then he would have no power at the resurrection. The resurrection is the turning point in time, the midpoint and the middle of his involvement with it, the most material involvement he has with it. But other people knew the Christ. They just saw him as the great sun being, or they saw Archangel Michael, Christ's countenance in the sun. But people knew about the Christ. Zoroaster knew about the Christ. Everybody in the sun cults were interacting with the Christ, but they would interact through his cosmic form because we were in a pluralistic pagan existence, and that's how our consciousness worked. It was part of an organism. We didn't have the ability to see Christ as a man yet. We had to build ourselves up to that through increasing materialism pressures and individualization. Only when we reach the point where we're ready to individuate do we see Christ, the second person in the Trinity, as a man. You just don't get to see God as a man until you're ready. And a lot of people weren't ready and still aren't ready to understand that principle. They think that Christ is a symbol, an archetype. They don't understand the rite of the crucifixion. They don't understand the Christ. And this again even goes back to this pagan consciousness that's still inside of people that still wants to see everything as a symbol, a metaphor, an archetype. This is that sort of tribal, symbolic way of existing where we weren't individuals yet, we weren't embodied yet. So everything was just a kind of concept. Nothing was real because we weren't really individuated yet. Okay. So eventually, as we near the turning point in time, or the incarnation of Christ, man has no clear direct experience or knowledge of the spiritual world as he did in earlier times. So by the time we get to the incarnation of Christ, again, humanity has pretty much little clairvoyance. There may be some mystics around, but it's not nearly to the level, like everyone used to have clairvoyance during the pagan period, everyone. And then it dwindles down to right before the incarnation of Christ when just a few people have it and maintain it, right? And just before the incarnation of Christ, we have the worst kind of occultism going on. This blood sacrifice. We have death cults in every single country all over the world. Every single continent is practicing blood magic and human sacrifice. The world has descended into its darkest possible condition. The world is possessed. And then we get the incarnation of Christ in man, and his blood changes the actual body of the earth, the etheric plane, and we now have the ability to transcend that. He is the last sacrifice, period. And he wasn't even really a sacrifice as happened in pagan times, as he willingly gave himself. And he was God in man, which is a little bit different too. So before the incarnation of Christ, man started to believe that he alone is the sole motivator of life. He does not believe he has to harmonize with God, and that the spiritual hierarchies, he doesn't believe he has to harmonize with God and the spiritual hierarchies. He now believes that it is his job to wield them according to his personal interest because, hey, and this is how a lot of dark occultists think. It's a very primitive way of operating spiritually. It's kind of like, have you seen those cat memes where there's like a box and it's a completely tiny little box, or it's like a really weird shaped thing, and then the cat hops in the box? And you're like, oh, I don't think you're gonna fit in that. And then the cat like makes itself sit in the box. This is like black magic. If I fits, I sit. So this is like black magic in the sense that it's like, if the ritual works for me, therefore it is good. If something works, therefore it is right. Therefore it is moral. So all black magicians and all people that will be susceptible to that, or even operating within that paradigm, they think that because something exists, that it is therefore good, that it should exist, that just existence alone is goodness. This is a pre-fall condition. This is the condition that humanity operated in when we were led by angels and we really couldn't sin. And so many people still have this consciousness that everything that they think is right, every urge that they feel in their lower centers is their true selves. And this is often confused with ideas of non-duality, that good and evil have to co-create in ourselves, have to exist in ourselves. We have to accept everything. This is the heart of extreme liberalism, right? But in the Christian era, this is not how we evolve. We have to overcome and transubstantiate our lower centers. And every impulse that we have actually is not holy. It's not good. Some of them actually harm us. They harm our soul. Some of them are an animal impulse that's based in fulfilling lower urges of survival, of control, of just seeking pleasure any possible way that you can, that anchors you into the material world, that makes it so you live an increasingly more and more material life because you just can't get your lower centers under any level of balance, because you keep feeding every lower urge that you have thinking it's holy, because the idea of post-fall and pre-fall consciousness does not exist in some people. And so everything that they feel is true. And the world has to, create safe spaces, or the world has to arrange themselves around their particular feelings or this identity that they create. Well, what if what you're feeling is not healthy for you? What if the urges that you have are stemming from something that is unhealthy within you? What if it's some kind of trauma response that you have? What if it comes from some kind of wound? What if constant seeking of pleasure is a distraction from you actually getting clear, releasing attachment, and knowing God? And so the other thing about the earlier pagan humanity is that we operated in more of like a pre-fall state. It was definitely post-fall, but we still had this kind of childlike state because we weren't fully conscious yet. And with full consciousness, such as we have now, comes full responsibility. And our responsibility is to go over all of our thoughts, all of our emotions, all of our impulses, and all of our urges with a fine-tooth comb and say, where can I take responsibility here? Is this actually coming from a wound? Why do I seek all of this material pleasure? Am I trying to seek wealth because I need to pay more attention to God, really, because I need to feel satiated in my relationship with Him. Am I seeking food? Am I seeking sex? Am I seeking this or that to feel some kind of connection that is actually a connection that I'm supposed to be having with God? So in the earlier pagan times, everything was externalized. We lived in kind of a tribal hive mind, and we experienced everything as an external pattern. Everything that we did, we experienced externalized because we had not yet reached a point in development where we could turn inward. So a lot of people still operate in that earlier time from really thousands and thousands of years ago, where they're not individuated yet, and they're operating from total attachment, totally letting their lower centers control their life, control their identity. And that's not objectively the phase that we are in now. We are in a phase where we must purify our lower centers through fasting, through evaluating, through contemplation, through meditation, and harsh honesty. So this is the difference between consciousness between the earlier pagan period and the post-Christ period. And people do not like to hear that, and that's fine. But consciousness evolves over time. The whole point in taking a life on earth is eventually to individuate. And then once you individuate, you spiritualize into an immortal form. That's called eternal life. You cannot reach eternal life or immortality or the diamond body in Tibetan esotericism. They had a structure too, while you are in a group consciousness. There is no immortality or reaching these higher levels of spirituality if you're operating in a tribal group consciousness, because if you're operating in that way, you're not able to take responsibility for yourself as an individual, because you're outsourcing every single part of your being to what the group thinks of you and to what you have to do to survive with your role in that group. So your development depends on you evolving out of your tribal nature and into your individuality, becoming a real embodied individual, and spiritualizing from there through releasing all of your impulses that are animal impulses rather than higher impulses that come from your higher self in Christ. So, blood magic, human and animal sacrifice were practiced regularly and deeply tainted and diluted humanity. The world descended into a complete inversion of the original pagan golden age, and much of humanity regularly participated in spiritual practices that brought forth demonic entities and lowered their consciousness. And this is the thing about it too. Listen, the more that you do degenerate acts, the more that you are like summoning demonic entities, doing all this kind of stuff, or even just acting demonic yourself, the more dark your consciousness and perception becomes, the more you see the world that way. So the more that you do it, the more you're dragged down, the more you're drawn to it, the more your sort of mind darkens, the more foggy it becomes, and the harder it becomes to rise. So there is an accumulative effect of sin or of poor behavior. If you keep doing it over and over and over again, it becomes more and more difficult to clearly perceive the spiritual world, because your activities are immoral, or what you're doing is working against yourself and insulting your soul to such a degree that that all has to be healed before you can truly go inward. Right? So the more people were doing blood sacrifice, the more people were doing all these really dark pagan rites, the harder and harder it became to really remember the high point of the culture that we fell from. And it was like it didn't exist. over time. And that's why the incarnation of Christ is so important, is because it saved us from this incredibly troubling era of really demonic practices. And this descent of humanity getting completely embroiled with fallen angels and demonic beings and bad contracts with elementals and things like that. So by the turning point in time when God finally incarnates in man, the pagan traditions have completely inverted and are in their most dark and decadent inversions. At this point, humanity is tasked to let them go, turn inward, and understand the new mystery before them, which is the mystery of Christ and immortality. The mystery of Christ and redemption. From this period on, there emerges two general streams of life. So we get the incarnation of Christ, which really provides the world with the capacity to individuate. And then you get these two distinct streams that emerge in humanity. You get the stream of life and the stream of death. Now, life and death, obviously, in earlier periods before Christ, people knew what life and death was. Obviously, they had intricate rituals around it. But life and death were seen as part of a greater grand cycle. So life was death, death was life, and the intricacies of life and death, the nuances of these processes spiritually and within the human being, were not known. It was more a focus on cycles of death and rebirth and life and death, rather than truly having humanity get in and understand life and death processes very, very scientifically and intricately. So now, at exactly the midpoint in the earth, we have two distinct streams. We have the life impulse, which was codified and made official when God incarnates in man and gives man eternal life and the ability to spiritualize. Christ's blood also gives the earth itself the capacity to spiritualize. So we have the life impulse, and we have certain human beings now organizing themselves around life and the mystery of life, the mystery of truth, the mystery of immortality. And then you have the death impulse, which is becoming more and more profound and had been taking control of humanity in a really big way for a long time. And you have groups, cults, all over the world that are organizing themselves around the life impulse or the death impulse. So you have life cults organizing around the Christ and his life and really how to establish immortality and transubstantiate matter and get off of the wheel of samsara and all of that kind of stuff. That becomes an intense focus of certain groups. Resurrection. And then other groups are not interested in that. They have that same intensity, but they're focusing it on death magic. They're focusing on a completely different kind of spirituality. They're clinging to the dark age of paganism. And these are two completely different streams, and they operate completely differently. When you are in the life impulse, the Christ impulse, you're not forcing yourself on anyone. You're not looking for power. You're not looking for wealth. You're operating under a certain kind of moral existence. You're not killing animals and spilling their blood and being like, this is for me, You're operating in a totally different moral paradigm and a totally different existence. Then you've got this death cult that's also forming, that is a total inversion of reality, total inversion of life, total inversion of everything good, and is totally, entirely based in power and control and materialism and self-aggrandizement, and ultimately they are possessed, because you cannot do any kind of death magic without giving a piece of yourself. Whereas when you work with the Christ, when you work in the light, there is no giving of yourself like that as food for something. You transform yourself in Christ's image and you create life. You create a higher immortal body. So these are completely different paths that begin to emerge on the planet. So the life impulse is the way, the truth, and the life. So the way is the way of eternal life, immortality. It is to transubstantiate eventually the very matter of your body into an eternal spiritual body that never dies. Okay, this is what we call a saint or a master. There's different degrees of this transformation that exist in initiation science and have for thousands of years. They would also be called in the Eastern traditions a Buddha, or perhaps a Bodhisattva, or a saint, or a master. Okay? Because this is a process of eternality that you literally transform yourself, your physical body, your etheric body, and your astral body in the image of Christ, through Christ, into an immortal spiritual form. That is the whole purpose of us being here. So that is the way. Okay? And the life impulse, the Christ impulse, and the cults and the religions that form around him, hopefully in their truest form, the truth is that when we unite with Christ and that transition does begin to happen, we purify ourselves to such a high degree and we glorify ourselves to such a high degree that we actually begin to understand the objective reality of the cosmos. We start to understand cosmic law. We start to have spiritual sight again. We regain all the spiritual abilities that we lost in order to become an individual. So we recover. So being psychic, being truly objectively psychic and creative, involves Christ. Anything else is false light. Why? Because it's the Christ within all people that purifies and gives you the clarity in order to truly engage in spiritual matters with the right focus, from the right place, from the right anchor. So when you are united with Christ, you just get the objective truths of the world, the objective truths of people. And nobody's perfect, but it is, it is a process. And of course, when you focus around the Christ impulse, it's all about how to individuate properly. How do you become an individual, and then as an individual form a healthy culture, a healthy society? Which of course is always underneath the Father, always underneath the objective, natural laws of heaven, right? All right. So, and with one of the main things that happens after the incarnation of Christ as well, and then you get all these different little societies and religions forming. Now we have three main dogmatic schisms, but after Christ's incarnation, there were actually lots of different ones that were forming and things like that. But they all had certain things in common ultimately. But one of the things that really also makes the Western esoteric system, or the Christian esoteric system, distinct from the Eastern ones, though they are not in competition, is that the Western esotericism starts to have a much more in-depth and robust idea of evil. Now, good and evil exist in the Eastern systems as well. Of course they do, but it's not talked about in the same way. And the Christian systems, they directly have images of like Michael slaying Lucifer. And within Christianity, there is this intense urge to purify, to create structures that allow for that, to protect the innocent. It's supposed to. And you start to get this real confrontation of evil in the world. And that also happens because humanity has finally individuated. And part of that individuation is confronting evil in the self. So for you to truly individuate, you have to go through this intense process of confronting your own darkness. And when you're operating in a group tribal consciousness, you're not going to get to a point where you're really going inward and confronting your darkness, because you're operating as though you're part of an organism. It's completely external. So with the Western esoteric tradition, it becomes much more about confronting evil in the world and evil in the self. And that's part of the individuation process and our relationship with Christ, which in the presence of Christ in our heart, with that goodness inside of us, anything that's not like him obviously appears. It obviously appears and starts to create a contrast, really. And so now that we have the Christ inside of us after his incarnation, our own darkness is coming out in a huge way. And we have to confront that because we now have this goodness inside of us that existed outside before. We knew it, but it wasn't within. And so once it comes within, suddenly we see evil because now we really have that good within us. So that is the effect of Christ in the body and the effect of Christ in the world. It is causing this battle between good and evil to become more obvious, because in order to spiritualize, we have to confront what is immoral and evil within ourselves. So that becomes the idea of purification becomes much more central, and also these images of confronting evil. It becomes much more individualistic. Obviously, again, that's because that's where humanity is supposed to go. So what about the death cult? That's the life cults that are forming. But what about the death cult? So the death cults are not having the same effect, obviously, on the people who are participating in them. The death impulse is entropy. So if the life impulse of Christ creates the transubstantiation of matter, it creates spiritualization inside of you. That's the effect of the Christ on you. Then the death impulse is the opposite. The death impulse is like more materializing. It is also drawing you deeper and deeper into matter. It is binding you to the earth, and then through the earth, the underworld. That's what the death cult does. It's entropic. It's a process of entropy. It is decay. It is the eventual fragmentation of your soul, not the transformation of your soul, the fragmentation of your soul, right? It is the path to perdition. So if you don't actually bind yourself together through the Christ and transform, then you fragment, right? It operates through vampirism and parasitism. So it creates groups. It's like anytime you're doing anything in the dark occult, it is always going to be vampiristic and parasitic. So you're going to have to give a piece of yourself to a demonic entity, and they're going to be able to operate through you. Yeah, you'll get money, you'll get worldly power, you'll have influence, but you're also going to be sharing yourself with a demonic entity. How do you like that? They don't respect your sovereignty. Angels and Christ are there to, help you transform yourself to be like them. But demonic entities are there to take over your form because they're so fallen and out of the cycle of evolution. They're now in the eighth sphere or the devolutionary arc of development that they have to experience through you in order to exist. Angels don't have to, like, feed on humanity, but fallen angels do. It's a completely different connection. Okay. So another part of the death cult is that there really is a refusal to leave the pagan practices behind. And really they work through, as we're going to see, they really work through spilling blood, and they work through creating death. So because you can't produce life in your body and creation without Christ, they have no other thing to do than to use death. They have to kill. And so over time, killing, whether it be war or assassinations or, different kinds of weird sacrifices and stuff that do different things, their whole entire art form becomes death. It becomes death-oriented, becomes centered around blood, and what happens when blood is spilled, and what happens when someone dies. So because they cannot actually harness life, which is completely internal and through Christ, they have to use death and blood. And that's the only power that's left. It's either kneel and bow to, Christ, or it is work through death. There are two paths that exist in the world. There is the Antichrist path, which is entropy, degeneration, death, parasitism, Ahrimanism, or there's life. And I want to mention one more thing about the death cult's inability to let go of these kind of dark pagan rituals is that I want to reiterate that in the early pagan times, humanity didn't do these rites. They never did death magic. It's only in the dark pagan times. And they were not working with the same being. So in the death cult, they would say, oh, I'm working with a sun hero. I'm working with Michael, or I'm working with this archangel, or I'm working with this spiritual being. So they're trying to use the image of an angel or some higher spiritual being that existed in early humanity as we were learning about the cosmos and stuff like that. But that's not the being that's showing up. So this is very common with these sort of black magic practices, is that people that do this, they think they're working with a certain kind of entity often, but that's not the being that's showing up. Okay, if you're going to sacrifice a cat or something, or a person, or use blood in the way the dark magician's doing, you're not contacting a higher angel. You are contacting a demonic entity, period. That's all you're doing. You're not working in the higher planes at all, because angels do not respond to that. Only fallen angels do, and demonic entities do. So there's this level of delusion and deludedness to people who start falling into this really primitive, archaic stuff where, I don't know, their magical textbook say that they're dealing with Michael or some angel of a planet, and you're not. Because a higher angel's not going to respond to a death rite. And in fact, again, any kind of death magic was never actually part of early paganism. It's a distortion of it. It's something that came from the darkest depths of humanity and hell. There was never a time where it was good or okay. There was a time where human beings were more innocent in what was going on with it. But it was never a high practice. It was never something that God wanted us to do. It was always going to be something that we were going to get embroiled in and then have to overcome. And there's different symbols for the death cult, which we won't get into in this particular session, but they would associate themselves often with like symbols of death. So like Saturnian imagery, which would be like a skull and bones, black sun representing the Negretto phase in alchemy. Sometimes they would also use lunar imagery. We'll get into the symbols of the death cult in a couple more videos, but they do have their own symbols, just like, different lighter groups have their own symbols too. And by the way, there are light and dark groups and organizations. All right. So after the incarnation of Christ, two distinct impulses emerge in the cosmos. The impulse of life and Christ, and the impulse of death and Antichrist. So you get life cults, you get life religion, you get life spirituality, Christ-oriented spirituality that is all centered around how do we become immortal? What is the resurrection mysteries? That let's understand Christ, the life of Christ and Christ within us. That is life. These are spirituality around life and Christ. These cults, this spirituality starts to form. And people begin to center themselves around that, integrating that. Then there's the death cults and people and groups that start to form around Antichrist culture and death magic and all of these sick things that really just drum up things from hell. They really just drum up things from the underworld. So people think they're probably doing something a lot more sophisticated magically, but it's the most unsophisticated thing that you could really ever do. And it's also the most dangerous thing that you could ever do for your soul as well. And it's important that people hear this. If you're thinking about going and getting like an edgy occult book out of the library, it's not edgy. It's just destroying your soul. Okay? There's really nothing edgy about that, right? So the Christ impulse lives inside every human heart and leads them to individualism, healthy spiritual individualism, purification, so a purification of the lower centers, and an augmentation of union with your higher self in Christ. Truth, and through that, immortality. The death impulse also lives within man and leads him towards selfishness, towards entropy, towards fragmentation, and eventually madness and destruction. And I'll say this too, most people who get very involved in the dark arts eventually do go mad. They eventually do go crazy. And this is because of the entropic fragmenting effect of dark occultism and of degeneracy. What it does is it actually breaks apart your core, whereas the Christ within humanity brings everything together so that it's actually transubstantiated into something higher. But this dark way of living, and it's not even just black magic, it's like if you are just attuning yourself into lower things all the time, it doesn't create an evolution of the soul, it creates a devolution, which is the fragmentation of your consciousness, which ends up leading to madness and insanity and often doing humiliating things. One of the final things that happens when you have possession really bad, or you're being overshadowed really bad by demonic entities, is they'll usually humiliate you. They'll usually get you to do really humiliating things. And they'll tell you, this is liberating you. You're confronting your fears. You need to, do this really degrading thing in public. You need to, do this really destructive thing to yourself, this really disgusting thing. And people think, oh, this is liberation. Oh, I'm freeing myself. I have no fear. I have no inhibitions. But really what the demonic entity is doing is getting you to completely disrespect yourself, to completely humiliate yourself, to mortify yourself, to lower yourself. Because objectively, we need to treat ourselves with honor. And moral feelings and moral approach to self and life genuinely heals you. There are objective things that heal a soul and that tear a soul apart. And you're never going to heal a trauma or a wound by some humiliating, degrading thing. But demonic entities will do this. They'll get you to participate in these things as sort of the final way in which they take control, because they know that your higher self and Christ would never, ever have you degrade yourself in the way that some people do when they're demonically possessed. In fact, you totally, totally protect yourself. You completely create a container for your healing. And it's not at all about the external world or external views or anything. Liberation becomes you making us honoring yourself, actually. And so we can see in our culture that there are tons of people that are struggling directly with some kind of spiritual possession because they're doing such bizarre, humiliating things in public. And as someone who specializes in esotericism, this is obvious. This could very well just be part of this demonic stuff, where you have to humiliate yourself in order to completely give yourself to these demonic entities. They destroy your self-image. They destroy any kind of rapport and nourishment that you have with yourself. They convince you to do the opposite, to destroy yourself, because then they can truly enter into you and feed on you. If you have any level of self-respect or any of that, then it's hard for them to get in. So the Christ impulse leads man inward, and all rituals that were once external become inward activity that liberates us from material life. This is important too. So in the post-Christ world, a lot of the things that were once an external ritual happen inwardly, and there's no need to externalize it unless you really want to, right? So all of the things that we were doing and participating in the height of the pagan period as part of a group organism where everything was externalized is now internalized and we see it happening within us. So in our period, there isn't really a need to externalize much at all, unless it's going to help us understand ourselves or the cosmos. There isn't a need to do these things. We already know deep in our soul the lessons of the pagan period. We already have that. We've done that. Now it's time to understand all of these processes that we learned through externalizing and focusing on nature. We have to understand them within ourselves as processes within our actual being. Right? So again, let's go back to sacrifice. So the death cult is like, I want to be powerful, so I'm going to kill this animal and spill this blood, or kill this person in a ritual or whatever it is. But the real adept, the real spiritual person, is disgusted by animal sacrifice and any kind of blood magic, okay? And they say, there's no need to sacrifice. What I need to do is I need to sacrifice my attachments. I need to let those go in order to become who I truly am as a spiritual being. So sacrifice is actually completely an inward process where you place on the altar of God what no longer serves you. A sacrifice today is contemplating God. A sacrifice today is releasing a bad habit, and doing so directly acknowledging that as you do this, you become closer to Him. It is saying, I'm going to change my attitude towards this, and this is going to be a sacrifice. Because when you have these bad habits, when you operate from attachment and all of your lower urges, and you're just a reactive person, it's easier. It's easier to use the material world to anesthetize yourself, to take your pain away. It's easier to just be disembodied. So it is a sacrifice. It is a sacrifice to go through the pain of becoming an individual, the pain of becoming a real person, the pain of becoming who you are supposed to be. And yes, we do have to process all of our trauma and all of our sin and all of that. We have to confront that. We have to overcome that. And we do that through God. But the sacrifice is inside of us now. And it really always has been. It's just that only recently in human development did we have the intellect developed as human beings to be able to actually objectively understand the process. When we were in our earlier pagan period, we just symbolically participated in these things by burning incense, by chanting, by offering things, bread, grain. That's how we understood sacrifice, is that we offered something that was meaningful to us, that we wanted, that we needed. Fasting is a form of early sacrifice because, it's of the height of the pagan period, because we wanted to eat. We wanted that material feeling of satiety. But we didn't. This is the kind of sacrifice that is appropriate, and that's what was appropriate during the pagan period too. But we didn't have the objective ability to know what was going on inside of us when we were doing that like we do now. We have the level of intellect for introspection now that we didn't then. So the Christ impulse leads man inward, and all rituals that were once external, that we were doing to understand nature, understand heaven, understand earth, become inward processes. That's what it means by the kingdom of heaven is now within. During the pagan period, during the pre-Christ age, the kingdom of heaven was outside. Christ was outside. He was the face in the sun. He was the Father in the Son. The kingdom of heaven was outside of man. It was an external experience that we were part of, that we were involved with, but it was outside. After the incarnation of Christ, God enters man. Now it is an internal experience. All those patterns we learned, all those archetypes, all those processes in nature and in heaven are taking place in us. As the Son enters man, as God enters man, all those processes become lit up inside of us, and we can now know them as parts of ourselves, as parts of our functioning. We no longer have to just rely on an angel telling us something or our clairvoyant vision. We can know through our own intellect. These processes that we once could only see in nature, we now know this is within. What a different way of functioning that we can't even really fathom because we take it for granted. But there was a time when human beings couldn't even fathom that God would enter a man. God could only be in the cosmos. God could only be nature itself. God could only be the life in the sun, God could only be working through the angels, through the many, through the multitudes, through the hierarchies. God could never enter a man. But as time passed and we became more individuated and less tribal, God enters man, the incarnation of Christ in Jesus. And now, 2025 years later, we're at the opposite end and we think, how could anybody ever think that God isn't in man? How could anyone ever think that God was in the sun, that God was in the cosmos, that God was working through these other gods, many gods, the spiritual hierarchies of the angels? How could anyone think that? And so we have this prejudice of this bias of where we are. And now we are biased towards intellect and materialism, and on the spiritual side, knowing that God is within us. We have a higher self. We have a soul. We have a higher self, a spirit, and Christ. And we think that's all, of course it's within us. It's, whatever, but we didn't always even think that was possible. And, only some people were able to fathom that the Christ was coming. These were the Essenes, right? The Essenes existed to receive the Christ, to prepare Jesus to receive the Christ, that was his initiation for his life. And they prepared the stage for Christ because there were people that knew the Christ was coming, of course. But most people didn't. They didn't even believe it. They didn't think that God could enter a man. And still to this day, people still think it's like a symbolic event, like it's a metaphor. People still don't understand the concept and how important it is when God, the second person, the Trinity, actually enters a human being, and why that is significant for earthly and human development. We're still in that pagan period with a lot of people, unfortunately, which means that if you don't recognize the Christ and his life, then you don't understand the mechanism within yourself. That's the problem. It's not that you have to believe that Jesus lived and was a historic person that's giving your power away or something to some dogmatic faith you don't like. It's that if we don't understand the Christ and his entire presence in the cosmos since its existence, we don't understand what it means when that enters a human being. And if it enters into one human being, then every human being and also our world. If we don't understand that, then we don't understand eternality and how to transform ourselves. So the whole point in being an evangelical or talking about Jesus, it's not some weird trying to sign someone up for your religion. It's that if we don't understand the Christ, then we don't understand our own mechanism of transformation. We don't understand how we become immortal. Because we have to understand that on a human level. You can't get to the highest levels of initiation science, which means transubstantiating your material form into an eternal one, without acknowledging how Jesus did that and who the Christ is. You just can't get to that point. There's a point where to consciously participate in your own initiation, you have to acknowledge that act, because it gave you a capacity that you now have to consciously engage in. So the highest form of Christianity is pure initiation science, which involves the Christ. It's not myth, it's not story. It is initiation science. That's real esoteric Christianity. That's the real point. That's the objective view of the spiritual evolution of man and planet. That's the point. So the Christ impulse leads man inward, and all rituals that were once external become inward activity that liberates him from material life. The death impulse drives man to continue to practice archaic rites that no longer suit the modern individualistic consciousness of man. I want to say one more thing. So in the life cult that works in Christ, death is seen as something that is ultimately overcome. So in Christianity, it's not that we don't respect the death process, that we don't understand it. It's that death is actually overcome. Death is not even the same thing as it was at the beginning of human life. There is no more death. Death still doesn't even exist as an end to us now. There is no real death. There's just transformation, obviously. But when you are an initiate, even your death process is different until there is no death, until you're completely liberated from materiality. Okay, it's like when you have a master, okay? If they want to take a material form, they can. Even the angels, if they want to take a material form, they can appear in a material form because they've transubstantiated matter. They've mastered it. They want to appear that way, they can, because they've integrated it, right? But if you have not reached immortality or some degree of that, then you have to have a material form. So people think that just because you have a soul that you're immortal. Not really, not in the way of Christian esotericism. Just having a soul doesn't make you immortal. Immortality, specifically in initiation science, means matter is transubstantiated. In the Eastern system, this is getting off the wheel of samsara. So it means you don't have to incarnate anymore. It means that you don't have to take a material life. It means you have transubstantiated all of the elemental matter that your body is made out of, in which you have a contract with in this life. You've liberated all matter. Right? So there's a difference between, oh, I have a soul and I take many different lives, to I don't have to incarnate in the material world. That's esoteric Christianity. It is the precise knowledge of how to do that. That's the resurrection mysteries. That's immortality. So in Christianity, it's the overcoming of death through understanding life, which is Christ. In the death cult, it is completely succumbing to death, going deeper and deeper and deeper into matter, binding yourself with entities in the subnatural, subhuman world, binding yourself into the eighth sphere, as Rudolf Steiner would say. It is succumbing to death. It is worshiping death. It is worshiping matter. It is having attachments and doing everything in your life to have more material things. That is death. To be in the death cult is to worship the material world, is to give every single lower urge you have life in you, to never go inward and say, you know what, maybe I've got some darkness in here, and turn inward and do some self-evaluation. Unconsciousness is the death cult too. And you don't have to all gather together and wear your skull thing, in the death cult or whatever. We all have had a membership to that at some point in our life, when we were destructive, when we acted in that impulse. Okay? So there's the overcoming of death and the working to do that, and then there is the worshiping of death. And in the worshiping of death and the using of death, you bind yourself into the demonic world by summoning these things. So the death impulse drives man to stay true, is because the further you go back in time, you're not getting a purer truth. You're getting the truth for humanity in that phase of consciousness, which we're objectively not in. This is why we get all of these weird UFO religions and alien religions, is because people go back and they read about Atlantis, or they read about Mesopotamia, or they read about these pagan phases when they were communicating with elementals and angels, and seeing light bodies and seeing like the orbs that appear as elementals and angels and things like that. And they're reading it like science fiction because they've read too much science fiction, right? So it's like people go back into earlier times with angels with a modern consciousness of scientism and materialism, and then they think that they apply that to ancient periods. And it's like, if you want to evaluate, these earlier periods of human development, you have to be able to create within your own being, or at least understand the consciousness that we had, the exact perception that we had, which was often a dreamlike, clairvoyant perception, especially the far back you go, where we're seeing angels and elemental beings in nature, and we're functioning in a kind of dreamy clairvoyance. Now we're in a totally different stage. So the issue often is that the death impulse holds people in this kind of lunar space, in this fragmented space where they want to use all of the past practices and all the past knowledge, anything but be in this time, anything but be in the actual real moment of life. They're always pulling you out of life, out of the right time, out of what is right for the time, and into the past, into the extreme future. It's never where you should be. Or it's taking these, it's making things, it's an imbalance is what it is. It's an imbalanced perception. So the death impulse drives man to stay the same rather than evolve into the current era. So the last thing the demonic world wants humanity to do is unite with Christ and be liberated from the material world, because demonic entities need human beings in the material world so they can feed on them. If everybody's just purifying their lower centers and working towards immortality, they're not going to have any dinner, right? So they don't want people to move forward in time. They don't want people to have a clear perception of reality. They want people to be living in delusions of grandeur. They'll tell you any lie to get you to connect with them. Anything that you want to hear, they'll tell you and try to give you, just to be vampirically connected to you. So this tension between life and death is the primordial battle between light and dark and good and evil. I just want to also tell you guys that to sign up for my newsletter, it's kind of more of an announcements letter. It lets you know when I'm going to go live. So I have that linked below so you can participate. Also, if you do enjoy this content, please consider signing up on my website to become a premium member. I have forums and there's always incredible discussions going on. I also do live Q&As twice a month where I answer all of your questions. It's really fun. So I'd love to see you there, or you can make a donation. That just helps me be able to show up like this and make these videos for you. So I really appreciate any support. All right, let's get into the final portion of this and really kind of directly discuss the death cult and how they operate. So now we know life, we've talked about Christ, we've talked about Jesus, we've talked about Christian esotericism and all that kind of stuff. We've talked about the death a little bit, but let's start to really focus in on the brotherhood of death. So the death impulse and black magic was really, really, really taking over the culture in the dark ages of paganism, and nearly every culture practiced human and animal sacrifice. In the UK, there was Burning Man. Burning Man is also what happens in the desert of Nevada. And, they used to actually put people in a human effigy and burn them, often prisoners or whatever, and animals. In South America, the Mayans were prolific with human sacrifice. We've all probably seen Apocalypto, and they'd usually be sacrificing to the rain god for weather. and all different kinds of things. Every single culture across Europe, South America, North America, the islands, everywhere, Africa. There was not a continent that did not practice some form of black magic, some kind of death cult, some kind of paganism. So it's dark paganism. It's really important to understand that there's different levels of the idea of the death cult. There are people who individually are just plugged into the death impulse. They're just on a bad path. And they're going to act in a certain way because their attunement is to the demonic plane. It's just a fact. Like, attunement is a real thing. You can attune yourself to life or you can attune yourself to death. And sometimes you have to look at it that way. Sometimes you've got to be strict with yourself to get to the truth of who you are and where you're focusing, right? But then there's also people who can organize, and they've been doing this since the beginning of time. There are people who can also organize and form direct cults, very precise cults around death, around black magic. So there's both. There's people who indirectly participate in black magic and in these kinds of things, in this way of life. And then there's people who are organized and do this. Of course there are. There's also people who organize around good as well. So they would, a lot of the time it would be to bring, they would shed blood to bring victory, to bring certain weather, to feed the sun, to have prophecy. One of the most disturbing forms of prophecy was probably the dark era of Druidism, where they used to actually, do that. And then they used to read how the blood pooled out of the body, really gruesome stuff. And this is actually one of the reasons why so many people were interested in Christianity and converted. A lot of people may not think that now, but a lot of people were horrified at the height of paganism because of the blood sacrifices that were going on, because of all the black magic. They wanted liberation from that way of life, right? So that's one of the reasons why Christianity did become popular, is because, during these earlier periods, we have to remember that, Christ came as the last sacrifice. And that's a big deal because at that time, what are you going to, wake up every day and wonder if your husband is going to be thrown in the wicker man and burned alive today, or, are you going to have to sacrifice your daughter into the volcano this afternoon? Right? It was totally barbaric and gruesome, and humanity was 100% ready for something higher because all of that activity is demonic. So now we view Christianity a little bit differently because we're 2,000 years later, and a lot of people view dogmatic Christianity as being very stifling. And I understand that. But a lot of people really were interested in Christianity because of how brutal the world was during this decadent era of paganism and blood magic, like just public blood. I mean, we're going to get into this next time, but we're going to get into like Rome and their death worship with war and the blood sacrifice to Mars, right? We don't understand how dark it was because we've been out of it. But it was mass black magic. It was mass sacrifices all the time. Even I just did a video a couple months ago about the Third Temple. Okay, they're killing cows. They're slicing the throats of the red heifers. They're practicing animal sacrifice. This is completely degenerate black magic stuff. I don't want to be supporting that. This is some archaic black magic going on, and it shouldn't be anything that America is accepting or trying to bring about at all. This is black magic, objectively. It's literally what Christ came to say no more of. So the idea that like evangelicals are now supporting the third temple and animal sacrifice and all of the thousands of more blood sacrifice that's going to come from the temple is bananas. It doesn't make any sense. And that's why spiritual science is important, because you can twist and turn the Bible any way you want. You see it all the time. We have to objectively know from a spiritual scientific perspective why something is appropriate and why it's not. And that is demonic. It is objectively demonic. Blood sacrifice, animal sacrifice, human sacrifice is demonic. There is no place for it in modern society. So one of the reasons why people started to do blood sacrifice, because again, that really wasn't something that early pagans ever did. But the one thing that the very early humanity had was clairvoyance. And when humanity looked at their body with their clairvoyance, they didn't just see a physical body. They saw their spiritual bodies. They saw their astral body, their etheric body. They saw the Christ being. They saw angels. They saw the entire makeup of the spiritual world overlapping them and working with them in nature. They saw all of that. And deep within their body, flowing through their veins, they saw the force of life itself. They saw that flowing through their blood. So when human beings in the early pagan period would look at themselves, they didn't see a physical form. They saw their energy bodies. They saw especially blood flowing through their veins. And when they looked at their blood, they could see that what was in their blood was the same force of etheric energy, of life energy that lived in the sun, the same prana that lived and breathed in the sun, in the Christ, was in their blood. And they could see that. And so they knew that their blood was where their individuality was, where their I was. As Rudolf Steiner would say, your I, your true self, is in your blood. That's the place in the physical world where your highest self operates and is anchored. And it's not in your nose, it's not in your hair, it's not in your spleen, it's not even in your heart. Your I, your higher self, your true ego, the part of you that lives in union with Christ, that is your truest self, lives in your blood. And blood is a very special fluid. And so we could see this, we could see that our identity, our soul, our highest self actually existed in our blood, and that was the point where it met our body. And so when times darkened and we couldn't see the angels anymore, and by the way, I want to say this about the Bible too, is people have trouble with the spiritual hierarchies now because the Bible doesn't specifically lay out angel, archangel, archai, exousiai, throne, whatever. But people assumed that. So the hierarchies of angels was assumed knowledge at the time the Bible was written. We then lost that knowledge and have to remember it. I just want to say that because so much of this pagan period is about the angels and gods and plurality, but that period then went into the Bible. It was assumed knowledge. That's why it's like, oh, Gabriel's here and he's part of the Annunciation with Mary, or you have, the cherubim at the thrones, and they're doing that and not explaining it because everybody knew about them. Like, you didn't need to explain it. A lot of things aren't in the Bible because people took that knowledge for granted, which is another reason why we need spiritual science, is to bring these elements back and center them around Christ in the world. So, getting back to this, when we lost that spiritual sight, the one thing that we did know, the one thing that we could remember, is that our blood is where our power is. The blood is where the life force is. Your blood is where your life force is. And so people, having lost the ability to see the angels as much, and the spiritual world is fading away, they began to experiment with offering to the earth, to the soil, the most powerful thing that they had. Because the angels had sacrificed themselves for humanity many times. And the great sun hero sacrificed himself every time the sun went down and rose again in the morning. And so humanity understood that you had to give something to receive something, and that every great angel and every sun hero and every great person that I knew gave something of themselves to connect with God. So why don't I give my most important thing? And then we'll be able to see spirit, we'll be able to interact with God. And so human beings started to spill blood. Animals and other people. And something different happened when they would spill their blood. When the blood would hit the soil and when they would kill. Is that all of these elementals would rise up and start to eat the life force in the blood. So they perform a sacrifice, and the blood would hit the soil, and then they could see, and then all these elementals would rise up and start to consume the blood, the life force in the blood, which causes decay. There's actually elemental beings that are called death elementals that are responsible for decay. They carry out the activity of decay. There's an elemental for every type of activity, okay? There are death elementals that are responsible for the transition of life into death. And this is entropy and decay. There are spiritual beings that all they do is carry out entropy and decay. They're not very pleasant to look at. And they realized that there was this transformation that happened when these elementals would show up, and when the elementals would show up, these entities would also show up. And they would appear in this feeding frenzy of the death process. So the death process is carried out by these elemental beings, which creates a kind of burn-off, a kind of haze, if you will, a kind of dark fog. And in it, these astral visions would appear, and power could be exchanged between the people who were offering the blood, which was to these entities sustenance. And they realized, oh wow, well, when we spill blood, these death elementals appear, and we can see astral visions in their process of decay. So when they're carrying out this alchemical process of decay, it's a transformational event, and in that, they can see spiritual visions. So as the portal of death opens, there's a kind of fog that can be tapped into, where there's a threshold that's crossed, and you can get into an altered state. So death can kind of create this altered state. But it's filled with the death elementals, and it's filled with beings from the world of death, from the lower astral plane, from the underworld, and from the subnatural world. And they started to realize the more that we do this, the more we can kind of ask for things. Right? And they would get them. Because all of these demonic entities have power in the material world. They don't really have a lot of power in the heavenly world, per se. They have to work through man to get to that. But they have a lot of power in the material world, especially if there's mass possessions going on. And so people started to actually work with demonic entities, thinking that they were Michael, thinking that they were these higher angels, these higher entities, because they were trying to perform their classical rites and things like that to the angels, but they didn't realize that death and the spilling of blood is evil. And so it started out from ignorance, but people became addicted to it because it gave them worldly power, and it allowed them to regain this kind of mystical vision that they had lost. Because when death happened, it allowed this kind of cheap and easy way to see into the spiritual world. They could experience that transformation while living. And every medium, and I have a lot of people who are mediums that watch, you'll understand here that mediums are portrayed usually with a skull, because in mediumship, you enter into the world of death. You have to be able to enter into that place while you are living. You have to be able to enter into the spiritual world while you are alive. So it's associated with that function. So you can have certain kinds of spiritual visions and certain kinds of spiritual events, and power can happen through death. But it is not the same, again, as like operating through life. These are completely different processes, as I said. So when humanity could no longer see the spirit world, they sought more and more tangible and material processes to experience the spiritual world. So over time, you see rituals externalizing more and more and more. So in the early pagan period, they were just like part of nature, just taking place in natural processes. I offer you some grain. Here is some incense, and you were just part of it. And then the more we separated, the more we try to remember it and connect by creating more and more externalizations of those earlier processes we were participating in. And it had to become more and more tangible and more material. So we kept externalizing ritual, externalizing natural processes and condensing them into rituals, more and more tangible things. And that's how we stayed connected with spirit. But then human sacrifice was, and animal sacrifice, any kind of blood magic and death magic was providing this really cheap way to access spiritual beings without healing yourself. So normally, if you were to be like a high priestess, or you were to be a priest king, or you were to be like a Merlin type, you would only get there through self-sacrifice. Even in the earlier times, even before Christ, the pattern was still the same. You were only going to be able to merge with the spiritual world if you were pure. If you purified yourself, if you sacrificed yourself, if you became in service to humanity, then you could develop these incredible abilities, or you could maintain them, things like that. But blood sacrifice and death, it allowed people to have these abilities for a brief moment without having to heal themselves, without having to confront their darkness. And so blood sacrifice and killing became a way for people who didn't want to do their inner work to get worldly power and have spiritual abilities that they would not have normally. And so it was like a magnet for a lot of immoral people. And then if you just think about it, there's also just a lot of ignorance. Like people couldn't tell the difference, because it takes us a long time to sense evil. And so people just didn't really know the difference between like a fallen angel and an angel. And that's partly why God allowed all this to happen, is that we had to understand that killing is wrong, and that blood magic is wrong, and death magic is wrong, so that we could understand life and transformation and overcome it and truly accept the Savior. So it's all part of a natural process, but, it was a decline. It was a definite decline. And again, the more that people participated in blood magic and death, the more possessed they would become, the more they needed to do it. And then they would have children that were born into these practices, and they wouldn't know any different. And so entire family lineages, entire forms of life were built around this. And it became naturalized because a lot of people didn't know any better. It was never okay, but we just didn't know any better, and we're really trapped in this cycle. And also demonic entities, the more blood was spilled, the more death, the more demonic entities began to compound their access on the earth and sort of objectively affect reality. That's why I have a zero tolerance for it, is I think that the earth needs to be completely cleansed of this behavior, because the more it's done, the more the world kind of darkens. And of course, when these different cults began to do this more and more and more, they began to find even more like sick ways, and it became more and more elaborate. So like now, at first it was just like, oh, entities appear when we do this, and then it was like, well, there's this entity and there's that entity, and they both represent a different kind of evil and different kind of darkness, and you call on this one for this, and then it just became this complete elaborate practice of summoning basically the underworld to the earth. And it just becomes more and more like, it's at this point, because people will always say, oh, this is Kabbalah, or oh, this is Hermeticism, or oh, this is, paganism or whatever. And at this point in time, none of those descriptions really describe it. At this point in time, the kind of magic that the death cult operates in is a spiritual, scientific level of black magic. So it's like the culmination of the highest form of paganism. I think one would definitely be Kabbalah, but there's also different kinds of European systems that would be used too, depending on the different people in that group. Different symbols, wouldn't be just one, it would be a culmination of different pagan streams into a very sophisticated techno-occultism that's really the occult science of black magic. That's really what it is at this point in time. It's totally getting outsourced into technology, which is the final externalization for those that are trapped in this group consciousness that never individuated, that are possessed. It's like now they're just solidifying the group consciousness through transhumanism and externalizing every spiritual ability you're supposed to get through Christ. So I digress, but you can see how the paganism and the death magic and all of that culminates in our time to be a kind of science. And it's a precise level of black magic and death magic that now it incorporates things like CERN, technologies that can actually affect the veil, free energy, it's just free energy. It's totally, just don't think about the process that's going on. It's just free, okay? We have these materialists that don't even know what the spiritual world is or the natural world, that are like, just use these technologies. They're great. Let's just have the AI God and the surveillance. It's absolutely wacky. And it's the same. It is impulse of control. It is the Antichrist impulse that drives people to externalize in that way and draw people into this weird group soul again. Transhumanism creates a group soul. Okay, when you think you're going to live forever through the machine, you're possessed. You need help. You need an exorcism. Let's just be real. You need things removed spiritually. Okay? It's really not hard. There's also, and this will be explored more deeply in another video, but there's this natural contention that happens between those that operate in the Christ stream or the life impulse, the Christ impulse, that are within that genre, and the people who operate in death. So there's a natural battling that's taking place as there's a spiritual battle in heaven. So you have these fallen angels that are ecstatic that humanity's practicing death magic because that's how you access them, right? And then you've got the angels who want to see humanity become like them and transcend matter entirely, transubstantiate matter entirely. And they're battling and they're working through humanity. So you've got human beings also splitting into two groups and fighting one another. And you'll get, for example, someone from, the death cult looking to take over the world. And they'll specifically aim to take out someone from the opposing side. So the battle in heaven is playing out through man. And you have people on the world stage that can affect all human beings, like different leaders, different powers, and they're engaged in this battle that's happening in heaven too. And so you have people from dark brotherhoods assassinating and killing that are in tune with the light or light brotherhoods. So you have and sisterhoods. You have this battle between dark and light that's playing out within every human being. It's playing out in heaven, and it's playing out in organizations, in different deep states as well. It's playing out in every level of creation. Individual level, collective level, different groups that arrange themselves around these impulses very precisely, and then in heaven. And so this is where you get into assassination magic, or that assassination, which is ritual death and the spilling of blood, but that can actually be a form of ritual for the death cult, which we'll get into in a couple videos as well. You're also getting into why war is part of the death cult's rites. So you're getting into this battle back and forth between a death cult and a life cult on the earth, the Antichrist and the Christ, because they're battling for souls. So let me just conclude this here, make sure I'm not missing anything. All right. So during the dark age of paganism, humanity began to use animal and human sacrifice and blood magic to access spiritual beings. This kind of death magic was not part of the original pagan practices, which worked through symbolic offerings to the spiritual world. But as humanity lost their clairvoyance and could no longer see spiritual beings, they began to seek more and more obvious, tangible connection with the spiritual world, and realized that blood was the key to doing that. That blood and death and entropy, the decay process that happened, was their shortcut to that. Since blood is where the life energy centralizes, they understood that offering it was a means to connect with entities. Unfortunately, the entities that responded to these blood rituals were from the underworld. They were demonic. and they would appear during the transformation of life to death, and they would feed on the life force within the blood. And this is actually one thing I want to really put an exclamation point at the end of, is that what's really going on, just to really clarify it, is that when you are doing a sacrifice, you are feeding a demon. You are feeding a fallen angel. That's their food. Okay? They're then going to do a favor for you. They are going to make you more powerful in the world. The more you feed them, the more powerful you become in the world. Materially, fame, whatever. Blood and death is the fastest, most powerful way to feed them, because they eat the life force in the blood. They'll also eat and bind to negative emotions, to anxiety, to stress, but that's not the most profound way. You need to understand that, because the dark era of paganism has not left us. It's just become more sophisticated. When you see someone assassinated in public like that, you have to ask yourself, am I participating in a dark occult rite? Because it has all the factors. The more people involved, think of it like as a festival. There used to be festivals where they would do blood sacrifice, animals and human as much as possible. They would slay thousands of animals and even people just to feed these demonic entities, just to get power, for war, for material gain, to maintain their kingship or whatever it was. Don't think that we are beyond this, because a huge number of people never left it, and they resent that they're being asked to stop doing it, because they genuinely think that this stuff makes them better than everyone else. So when you see a public assassination, when you see public death like that, especially when you see the blood like that, and it is broadcasted for all the world to see or talked about over and over and over and over again, are you participating in an occult rite? Because what's the difference? What's the difference in being in 3000 BC and everybody's banging their drum in a frenzy as they're killing whatever and then tossing that to Moloch? It's death, it's blood, it's public. And now the world participated into it and gave it energy. So we are still participating in dark paganism. And when you see an assassination like that, especially of a public figure, the more high profile, the more more participation, the more powerful it can become. We need to understand this. And we need to absolutely have zero tolerance for any more bloodshed moving forward, because that's going to compound. As I mentioned in the last video, this is classical dark occultism. It's classical death magic. No more war, no more death. Because there are people that are using this, leveraging this to sink the world into a complete chaotic mess where they think they're going to rule, but they're not understanding the demonic entities that they're communicating with are using them. And that's the sad part about all of that, right? So demonic entities would offer, in exchange for blood, worldly power. Okay, if you commit these sacrifices, you murder people, you do a public assassination, especially, it's like a mass festival basically, mass trauma, then you'll get worldly power. You'll have prophecy. You know, people would do this in order to experience prophecy, to see the future, whatever that may be. Wealth, or conquer an enemy. they can do this and then concentrate power against the group that they don't like. The more people that see it, the more people that participate in it, the more that that's in the collective. In the beginning, humanity didn't know the difference between light and dark because we weren't individuated yet. And when they did these things, they believed that they were angels. They didn't understand the difference between a fallen angel and an angel. However, over time, it became more and more clear that these death cults were communicating with inhuman demonic beings, inhuman demonic things, and that these things required death and blood. And that if this death cult could provide that, then that cult could rule the world. So, if there is a death cult, and they have these ancient contracts with these beings and these egregores and these golems and things, these homunculuses and things that they've created, the more death they can create, the more chaos they can create, the more blood they can shed, the more they get to rule the world. Because there are two impulses on this planet. The impulse of life, which is internal transformation and acknowledgement of the Christ. And there is death, which is externalism, external power, all centered around blood and death. And we need to return to this knowledge now because this is rearing its head again so that we can reject it. So that we can say, we're not doing this anymore. We've been doing this for thousands of years. And we are liberated in spirit, but not in flesh. To liberate ourselves, we have to reject this. To reject this, we have to understand it. So I hope after this 2.5 hours today, maybe we can have more understanding towards what the death cult is, rather than just sharing weird pictures of the Illuminati, weird pictures of guys doing weird things in masks or whatever. It is so much more than that. To confront this, we have to understand on a scientific level what it is. And we have to choose better. And we have to come together and reject this. Because it is going on. Thank you guys so much for joining me. As always, I appreciate any signups on my announcements letter so you can catch a show whenever I do it. Do please consider supporting my work by becoming a member on my website or making a donation. I really appreciate that. Other than that, you guys, I will see you very soon with another episode of Occulted where we will go even deeper into the death cult next time and through history, and also learn to understand it through its symbols. We are going to leave no stone unturned. So I hope to see you next week, and also give me a like, subscribe, share this video, do a comment below. I really appreciate that as well. You guys, as always, all my love your way. And I'm going to see you in the next video.